accusations, and the trial. Fear has no need for truth, it only needs a spark. And in the winter of 1692, fear became fire. The whispers had turned into certainty. Villagers now spoke openly of Anna and Grace's unnatural closeness, of the way their eyes lingered too long, the way they slipped into the woods together. To the men of the village, these were not just rumors, they were proof. Proof of witchcraft, of temptation, of the devil moving unseen among them. It was Reverend Blackwood who gave the first voice of authority to these fears. Standing in the pulpit, his voice thundered, "Wickedness hides in plain sight, and it is not always the witch with her potions. Sometimes it is the woman who smiles too long, who tempts another from God's path. Such sins spread like rot, and if not cut out, they shall devour us all." The congregation shivered. Eyes shifted to Anna, then to Grace. That night, a group of men came to Anna's door. Their torches glowed against the snow, their fists heavy against the wood. She was dragged into the square. Grace was already there, bound at the wrists, her face pale, but her chin held high. The villagers surrounded them in a circle of flame and frost. Blackwood stood above all, his black cloak moving like a shadow in the torchlight. "These women," he declared, "are accused of witchcraft, of spreading corruption in our midst, of lying with one another in sin. Tonight, we place them before God's judgment." The women were hauled into the crude meeting house, which doubled as the trial hall. Inside, the air was stifling with smoke and tension. Men filled the benches, while women clutched their children close, whispering prayers. The accusations were read aloud. A farmer swore he had seen them kissing in the forest. A widow claimed her cow had gone barren after Anna looked at it. Another said she had heard laughter in the night. Laughter not of women, but of witches. Grace's eyes burned with fury. "Lies!" she spat. "All of them!" Blackwood's gaze cut her down like a blade. "The devil always teaches his servants to deny." Anna trembled, but she found her voice. "What crime is it to love? What crime is it to care for one another in a world that gives us nothing but hunger and fear? If this is sin, then I am guilty. But I will not bow to a lie." A gasp ran through the hall. Never had a woman spoken so boldly. The men on the council exchanged uneasy glances. They were used to silence, not defiance. But Blackwood smiled thinly. He knew the crowd's fear was already in his grasp. "Then you confess," he said smoothly. "Your own lips prove the devil's hand upon you. There is no greater corruption than a woman who lies with another." The hall erupted in shouts. "Burn them! Cleanse the village! Make them confess!" The trial turned into a storm. No defense mattered. Each word Anna and Grace spoke was twisted into proof of guilt. Their courage only fueled the villagers' rage. By night's end, the verdict was sealed. Guilty. The sentence? Execution by fire at dawn. The women were dragged back to the chapel cellar, bound in chains, left in the cold darkness to await death. But there in the silence, Anna and Grace clung to each other. Their hands, though chained, found a way to touch. Grace whispered, "If we burn together. But I will not let him win. Not in my heart. Not tonight." Anna pressed her forehead to Grace's. "Then tonight, we live. Even if tomorrow we die." And as the candles flickered above, their lips met once more in the shadows. Defiance in the face of death. Love as their final prayer. The verdict was death. The fire was waiting. But what the village did not know was that fire does not always consume. Sometimes it reveals the truth, and sometimes it sets the guilty ablaze. The execution and the twist. At dawn, the fire was waiting, but not all flames consume. Some reveal truth, and some devour the guilty. The sun rose pale and cold, its weak light crawling across the snow. In the village square, a wooden pyre had been built high, stacked with branches that crackled in the frost. The villagers gathered in silence, their breath forming clouds in the morning air. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Men stood grim with arms folded, and all eyes were fixed on the two figures dragged into the square in chains. Anna and Grace. Their cloaks were torn, their wrists bound, their faces pale but unbroken. They walked with their heads high, even as the crowd spat words like knives. "Witch! Sinners! Burn them!" At the front stood Reverend Blackwood. His black hat cast a long shadow across his face, his voice booming like thunder. "These women have confessed with their own lips. They are guilty of corruption, guilty of unnatural desire, guilty of bringing the devil into our midst. And now we shall cleanse our village in flame." The crowd roared its approval. The women were forced onto the pyre, their ankles bound to the wooden stake at its center. The cold bit into their skin, but the firewood below them promised a crueler fate. Torches were brought forward. The flame danced hungrily, waiting to rise. Anna turned her head toward Grace, her voice barely a whisper. "If this is our end?" Grace pressed her forehead against hers. "Then let them see that love does not burn." And then the torches dropped. The flames leapt, licking the dry wood. Smoke billowed, sparks flew, and the crowd leaned forward, eager for the spectacle. But something was wrong. The fire roared high, but it did not touch the women. The smoke curled around them, the wood hissed and cracked, but the flames seemed to bend away, leaving Anna and Grace untouched. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Fear flickered in their eyes. "A sign! It's a sign!" someone gasped. Blackwood's face darkened. He stepped forward, shouting above the roar. "Do you not see? The devil protects them. This is his work." But then a scream cut through his words. From the edge of the pyre, one of the men who had carried the torches stumbled backward, clutching his arms. His clothes had caught fire. He fell into the snow, writhing, as the flames devoured him instead. Another torchbearer tried to stamp out the fire, but the flames leapt from him to the next, spreading wildly, not toward the pyre, but outward, toward the men who had lit it. Panic erupted. Villagers screamed, scattering as fire spread across the square, chasing the guilty while sparing the accused. Anna and Grace stood untouched, their chains glowing red-hot until they snapped loose. They stumbled free, smoke swirling around them like a cloak. Their eyes locked on the crowd, a sea of fear and disbelief. Grace raised her voice, louder than she thought possible. "You see? Innocence cannot be burned. It is guilt that feeds the flame." The crowd froze. Whispers turned to shouts. Not against the women now, but against the preacher. "He lied!" one man cried. "He deceived us!" another shouted. Women clutched their children, remembering the nights Blackwood had summoned them in secret. Eyes turned on him now, suspicious, angry, fearful. Blackwood's face twisted in rage. "Fools! Do not be deceived! They are witches!" But his voice was drowned out by the rising roar of the people. His shadow, once so long and heavy over the village, now seemed to shrink in the flames. Anna stepped down from the pyre, Grace at her side. For the first time, they walked not as the hunted, but as survivors. Their hands, no longer bound, found each other openly in the square. The fire behind them still burned, but it was no longer their grave. It was their proof. And though the crowd had not yet spoken judgment against the preacher, the shift had begun. His mask of holiness was cracking. The fear he had ruled with was slipping through his fingers. For Anna and Grace, dawn had not brought death. It had brought a beginning. The pyre was meant to destroy them. Instead, it set the truth ablaze. The women who were supposed to burn walked out of the fire, and the preacher's shadow was shrinking fast. Justice and survival. Some fires cannot be controlled. Some shadows cannot last forever. The village that once condemned would now be forced to face the truth. The fire had spared them. Anna and Grace stood free at the foot of the blackened pyre, their chains broken, their skin unburned. The villagers who had gathered to witness their death now stared in awe and terror. Whispers rippled through the square. A miracle. It is a miracle. Grace raised her hand, her voice ringing through the smoke. If we were guilty, the flames would have devoured us. But see, it was innocence that the fire protected. The crowd shifted uneasily. Mothers held their children closer. Men lowered their torches. The fear that had been directed at the women now turned, quietly, steadily, toward the preacher. Reverend Blackwood stood tall, though the shadow of doubt flickered across his face. "Do not be deceived," he thundered. "This is the devil's trick. They are witches, and their survival proves their corruption." But his words no longer carried the same weight. The people remembered his visits to their homes in the dead of night, the confessions whispered in fear, the punishments he dealt in secret. The longer he shouted, the weaker his power felt. One man in the crowd finally spoke. And what of the men who lit the fire? Why did it take them instead? He pointed to the scorched earth where the torchbearers lay smoldering, consumed by the very flames they had unleashed. The crowd erupted. "They were guilty!" shouted one woman. "The fire spared the innocent!" yelled another. The voices grew louder, no longer against Anna and Grace, but against the man who had condemned them. Blackwood's face twisted in rage. He slammed his Bible against the pulpit. "Silence! You will not question God's judgment." But it was not God's judgment they feared anymore. It was his, and his hold was breaking. Anna stepped forward, her voice steady. "You claim to serve God, Reverend, but your fire revealed the truth. It is you who stand in judgment now," the villagers murmured, some nodding, others stepping closer to the women with cautious respect. The shift was happening, slow but unstoppable. Grace touched Anna's hand, openly this time, in front of them all. "We will not hide," she said loudly. "Not our love, not our truth. We were meant to die today, but instead we live, and you must all choose whether to cling to fear or to walk in the light of truth." The square fell silent. Smoke curled around them, framing their figures like spirits untouched by the world's cruelty. And then, from the crowd, an older woman stepped forward, her face lined with age, her eyes steady. "I have seen too much to stay silent," she said. "He has ruled us with fear. But the fire shows who is righteous. And it is not him one by one. Others joined her. Men lowered their heads. Mothers whispered to their children. The village that once condemned was beginning to shift, its heart beating a different rhythm. Blackwood roared, his voice raw with fury. "You dare defy me? You dare side with—" But he was drowned out. The people no longer feared him. Anna and Grace stood side by side, no longer the hunted, but the ones who had survived the fire. Their love, once condemned, had become a symbol. Their defiance was now their strength. That night, the council met, not to condemn the women, but to decide the fate of Reverend Blackwood. And for the first time, his seat of power felt fragile. Anna and Grace were given a place to stay, food to eat, and, though not yet complete acceptance, the first taste of freedom. They had walked through fire and lived. And now, the shadow that had haunted them was beginning to fade. The pyre had burned away more than wood. It burned away fear, revealing the truth. And in its light, the women who were supposed to perish began their survival. Together. Every shadow ends when the dawn is strong enough. And in this village, dawn was finally breaking. The snow kept falling, but the village was no longer silent. For days after the failed execution, whispers filled every home, every path, every gathering around the fire. The miracle of the pyre, 2 women walking unburned while the guilty were consumed, had broken the fear that bound the people. And now, those whispers had turned into voices. Voices calling not for Anna and Grace's punishment, but for Reverend Blackwood's judgment. The preacher's fall. The council called for him. Inside the candlelit chamber, the air was heavy with smoke and tension. Blackwood stood before the men he had once commanded, his Bible clutched tight in his trembling hands. His voice thundered with practiced rage. "You cannot betray me! You cannot betray the word of God itself!" But his fire no longer burned. The council members shifted uneasily, their eyes avoiding his. They remembered the villagers' voices, the women's survival, the unnatural flames that spared them. They remembered the screams of the men who had lit the pyre. One councilman finally spoke. "Reverend, the fire has spoken louder than you." The words cut through the room like a blade. Blackwood's face twisted, his mouth opening in fury, but no one listened anymore. His power, built on fear, had crumbled into ash. The council stripped him of his authority. His Bible was taken from his hands, and the man who had ruled the village with iron sermons and whispered threats was cast out into the cold night. His shadow stretched long one final time, and then it was gone. The village awakens. For the first time in years, the village felt light. The bells no longer tolled in fear, but in relief. Mothers no longer shushed their children when they laughed too loudly. Men no longer bowed their heads to avoid the preacher's gaze. And in the square where the pyre once stood, Anna and Grace walked freely. They were not yet embraced by all. Some villagers still whispered, still avoided their eyes. But no one raised a hand against them. No one tried to bind them again. Their love, once hidden, now lived in daylight. Grace would take Anna's hand openly as they walked, daring the world to look. Anna, once quiet with fear, now held herself proudly, her eyes meeting anyone who stared. The fire had not only freed them, it had taught them who they were. The rebuilding. The weeks passed, and the snow melted into spring. The village, scarred by fear, began to rebuild in small ways. Crops were planted without whispered curses blamed on witches. Children played without looking over their shoulders. And in a small cabin on the edge of the woods, Anna and Grace built a life together. The villagers, though still uneasy, allowed it. Some even brought bread, milk, or cloth to their door, quietly acknowledging the women's survival as a sign of something greater. Inside the cabin, laughter finally replaced whispers. They shared meals by the fire, planted herbs in the soil, and at night, when the candles burned low, they held each other without fear of chains, without fear of torches. They had walked through fire and come out whole. That was their miracle. A new dawn, months later, the village gathered again in the square. This time, it was not for judgment, but for renewal. A new council had been formed, chosen by the people, not dictated by fear. The pyre, once a symbol of cruelty, was torn down. In its place, they built a fountain, water flowing where flames once burned, a reminder that life could rise where death had nearly claimed it. Anna and Grace stood among the crowd, hands entwined. For the first time, they were not the focus of whispers. They were simply there, part of the village, part of its future. Grace leaned close to Anna, her voice soft but steady. "We survived the fire, and now we live." Anna smiled, pressing her forehead against hers, the way she had at the stake. Together. The legend. As years passed, the story of that winter night grew. The tale of the fire that spared two women spread beyond the village, whispered in nearby towns and carried along trade roads. Some called it witchcraft, others called it a miracle. But those who had been there knew the truth. It was the day fear burned away and love remained. Children grew up hearing of Anna and Grace, not as sinners, but as survivors. The preacher's name faded into shadow, forgotten except as a warning of what fear could create. And in the cabin by the woods, the two women lived quietly, growing old together. The world outside was still cruel, still suspicious. But in their village, something had changed. Love had left its mark. They tried to burn away their love, but the flames only revealed its strength. The preacher's shadow fell, but the women walked into the dawn. And in the end, history did not remember the fire.